All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you everyone for joining. My name is Gretchen Gordon. I'm the coordinator of the Coalition for Human Rights in Development. And the purpose of this call today, this webinar today, which is Tools for Environmental and Human Rights Defenders, Demystifying Development Banks, is to provide an overview of development banks for environmental and human rights defender groups to help those groups identify and understand who are the financiers behind development projects which can put defenders at risk. And then secondly, to explore how defenders can potentially utilize development banks and other financiers to prevent harm to defenders or to seek remedy for harm that has occurred. Let me just do one quick check. Is everyone able to hear okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get started. We have on the agenda, we're going to start off with Jessica Evans with Human Rights Watch, talking about the connection between development finance and defenders. So Jessica, I'm going to turn it over to you, but before that, one logistical note. So I'm going to have folks on mute. You can type any questions you have into the chat function, and then during the Q&A, I'll call on people who have entered questions. So let's, without further ado, turn it over to Jessica Evans with Human Rights Watch.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for joining, and I look forward to the discussion. So I wanted to talk a little bit about why international financial institutions like the World Bank and like the regional development banks are interesting or should be thought about by groups that are trying to defend the work of human rights defenders. As we all know, and as we've all experienced and seen, there is an increasingly broad and sometimes brutal attack on human rights defenders in a growing number of countries around the world. And what we've seen is that a number of these attacks are targeted against people who are working on development projects. The UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders has highlighted that land rights activists and environmental defenders are most at risk. And the former Special Rapporteur particularly highlighted that those working on large development projects are particularly at risk. And this is exacerbated by the increased sophistication and effectiveness around the world of illegal surveillance and the way that that's used against community members, journalists, and NGO workers who are working to make development more inclusive and more effective and more grounded in what communities actually want, as well as those who are trying to raise concerns about problems with so-called development projects. What we've seen in a number of countries is that people who are working to make development projects better are criticized as or labeled as anti-development. In Uganda, we've seen President Museveni for many years now label these people, these NGO workers and community members, economic saboteurs. He's emphasized that they're bent on frustrating or delaying investment rather than recognizing that the work that many of us, that all of us do, is actually trying to make development more effective for the people who are actually going to be impacted. And in India, as another example, we've seen people labeled anti-government sympathizers of Naxalites. And this messaging in India doesn't so much come from the government, but comes from pro-government media and agents of the government, but not the government directly, complicating the situation there. Back in 2015, and for a few years before that, Human Rights Watch began to do some research to try and understand how real or how widespread is the problem of reprisals against critics of World Bank Group projects. We knew of a number of cases where our colleagues had been under attack, but we wanted to get a better understanding of just how widespread it is, because we constantly hear from the international financial institutions that actually it's just a few bad apples, that there are a few remote cases where people are under attack or where projects have gone wrong, but we believe that it's a much bigger problem than this, and that it's all the more challenging within the closing space or the increasing attacks on civil society to actually bring to light instances where people have faced retaliation because of their criticism or in some way linked to their criticism of development projects that are financed by international financial institutions. So in order to get some understanding, and this is a very much an imperfect methodology, we attempted to contact all of the people who had complained to the independent accountability mechanisms that are linked to the World Bank Group. So as you'll hear later on today, there are two particular independent accountability mechanisms within the World Bank Group. One is the inspection panel, which works on the public lending side, where there's lending to governments, and then the other is the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, which works on the International Finance Corporation side, where there's lending to private companies. And while we were only able to make contact and have substantive conversations with complainants who had brought 34 of the cases, 18 of those reported that they had faced, or that community members that they had worked with had faced threats, harassment, or some other form of reprisal that they believed was directly linked to their criticism of the World Bank finance projects. And there are two more cases where people had faced some form of retaliation, but they didn't believe that it was directly linked. So you can see that it is a very significant problem for people. Now, I don't believe that people are more likely to face reprisal if they utilize these accountability mechanisms. That's not what we were trying to show here. It's more so that if no matter how people want to show their criticism of these development projects, be it speaking publicly, trying to convince the government to change by directly speaking to the government, or by using these independent accountability mechanisms, they can be susceptible to some form of retaliation. And reprisals can look really different in every case. What we found was that irrespective of whether it was a public finance project or a private finance project, the retaliation could be carried out by the government, by companies, those that were directly receiving money from the International Finance Corporation, or other companies that somehow stood to benefit from the development project. Independent contractors were responsible for several of the reprisals that we documented, and even some elements of the community were responsible and alienated others within the community because they felt that they stood to benefit from the project. The kinds of reprisals that we documented, I'm sure that you're familiar with from your own work, but we saw a number of cases of arbitrary arrest and detention, often without charge, but sometimes with trumped-up charges that then went before the courts. We saw physical attacks, threats and intimidation. We saw job losses, and actually I didn't document any cases where the job losses were directly against those who were the most critical of the project, but often it was against their family member, because a family member had a public service position where they stood to lose that source of income. And we saw other attacks against both legal and physical, and others against family members. So in one case we saw serious bullying against students of the women human rights defenders who were standing up against a World Bank finance project. We also saw NGO deregistration, both in Uganda and in Cambodia, or a threat of it in Uganda, I should say, and then suspension in Cambodia, and a number of cases of crackdowns on protesters. So I'm sure that you hear this and think that it's all the same kind of reprisals as we see against human rights defenders outside of the development realm, but just to emphasize that it's very much within the development realm as well. So why should we advocate with the financiers of development projects and think about the development links. I think one of the reasons that it's really useful for me is because in a number of the countries where we work, where there have been such severe crackdowns on human rights defenders, we don't have other advocacy targets that we can put pressure on effectively anymore. In Ethiopia, for instance, the government is very resistant to any kind of internal or external NGO pressure. It's very resistant to the criticism within the media. But the World Bank and the other development financiers, particularly the UK government, have still a great deal of influence there. And I believe that if we press them, that we can provide hopefully at least a degree of pressure to make the situation better for human rights defenders that are working directly on these development projects. Secondly, international financial institutions have a responsibility to ensure that there is a safe space for communities that are impacted by their projects to be able to freely share their views. And for human rights defenders that are working with those communities or that are trying to change the way that development happens within their countries, the international financial institutions have a responsibility under international law. And then finally, these elements of these international financial institutions are starting to realize that that working to create or to recognize and to protect the space for human rights defenders does fall within their responsibility. Now, I think we have a very long way to go in this respect, but at least a couple of the independent accountability mechanisms have recognized that there is a real risk to their complainants and that they need to take measures to prevent, monitor and respond to any kind of reprisals against complainants or people working with complainants, and to take quite a broad view of who may be linked to the development project. So I think we have a long way to go, but I think it's a great opportunity for us to work together and hopefully get these quite influential actors on our side and actively working to create a safer environment for human rights defenders. I'll stop there and turn over to my colleagues, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Jessica. So I don't see any direct questions right now yet in the chat, so we'll go ahead and move on to our next speaker, who is Juan Carballo with the Foundation for Development of Sustainable Policies, FUNDEPS, in Argentina, and he's going to discuss how development banks work and how to access information. And again, if people have questions, do go ahead and put them in the chat function, and we'll entertain questions after each of the subsequent speakers. So go ahead, Juan, and do let me know as you'd like me to advance your slide.
Okay, thanks, Gretchen. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here remotely with all of you, and thanks for joining us. So I'll be talking briefly about how development banks work and some general ideas and some tips on how to access information about projects that might be impacting human rights in your countries. So in the first one, what we would like to stress is that development banks are public institutions and that are using public resources, which means that they are subjected to, or they should be subjected to, greater accountability than other type of financial institutions. This also means that these institutions are governed by member states. This could be both for multilateral development banks, such as the case of the World Bank or the Inter-American Development Bank, for instance, but it could also be the case for national development banks, such as the National Bank of Brazil, for instance. Next one, please, Gretchen. So what they usually do is that they channel funding, which can take which could be channeled in different ways. So it could be a loan, which means that it needs to be returned with interest from the country. It could be grant, it could be support in other projects which has funding from other sources. It could be technical assistance for certain specific programs or projects that a government is implementing, or it could be equity investments directly in a company. Next one. So this means that basically the development banks can connect both with the government and with the private sector. At the government level, it's important to take into account that the national government is always involved in these type of processes, but that, for instance, the implementing agency could be a subnational governmental body. But even if that's the case, the national government will still be involved in it. And the private sector would always be in connection with projects that are supposed to have development outcomes. So shouldn't be for general support for the private sector. Next one, please. And this type of support, and we'll see this later on, but it could go for specific projects, so very individual and concrete initiatives for a certain project. It could be thanks. So and it could be, or it could be for broader type of initiatives from that are connected to the government. So it could be either for programs or for policies, which each one of those are more general and would include, for instance, more concrete or more specific projects. The next one, please. This is the project cycle, and just as a first general idea, the project cycle shows how this type of process includes an interaction between the government and the bank. And there are certain moments in which civil society can be more influential, and we'll talk about that later in the webinar. But it's important to know how the whole cycle goes, just to understand in which part of the process an eventual funding will be going. So in the first part, for the identification for project, this is supposed to be connected with the way in which a national development plan has been developed by the government. It's also connected with the country strategy, which is usually a document that has been developed jointly between government and a development bank. Some of this information and some of these documents are available, not all of them, and some of the sources of information for these documents, so the type of research in which they are basing their strategies and objectives for a given country, might be available or not. It depends on what type of information each document contains. So based on that, the government produces a technical, institutional, economic, and environmental studies for a specific project. There are regulations on this, and some of the documents needs to be shared with the public, so released publicly in their websites. After that, the following stage will be the appraisal, in which the bank staff review the work done in the previous two stages, the identification and preparation, and they try to make sure that this project meets the standards of the lending institution. The approval includes usually a negotiation, and that takes place at the board. As I said in the beginning, we should take into account that the board is comprised by member states, so they are subjected to also public accountability, usually in connection with financial ministers or economy ministers, depending on the country. After it's approved, the implementation takes place at the country level, at the implementing agency, so that's usually a governmental body, and it does have some supervision by the bank. And the following stage, which is monitoring how the whole implementation goes and what happens after all the funding has been channeled and the evaluation of the project, is not usually a stage in which the banks are very strong. So that's usually a role in which civil society needs to step in. The following, please. As you see, it's important because there are so many stages involved in this type of funding that it's really important to know as in advance as possible what are the plans and what are the type of projects that are being under negotiation. So taking that into account, there's this initiative that you might be familiar with, which is the early warning system. What you can see in the presentation, it's a screenshot of what you can see on the website. And that's information, as the name of the initiative says, it's early warning. So you can sign up for alerts, so you can get information on projects that are being under negotiation on your area, on your country. You can look for information with specific type of, in a specific type of sector, for instance, just to know in advance what's coming up to specific area, and using that information, trying to advocate for a better project or just to change it. In other cases, just to oppose the project altogether. So that's one source for information for this type of projects. Next one, please. Another source of information, it's an initiative by Inclusive Development International, which is basically a toolkit that it's also available on the website. That has some tips and some examples from what worked in other countries for advocates to be able to find information about who's behind a specific project, who's funding a specific project, just trying to make that project more accountable. Next one, please. And another option would be to reach out to some of the bank watchers or people organizations that have expertise and experience looking for information on companies and banks, and I just share as an example the work of SOMO. Chris will be speaking later, so I'm sure she'll know better. But information on what are the relationships between a certain company working on a project and other bigger companies, and how the funding is channeled to those companies could be sometimes difficult to find. So reaching out for assistance with those that have some experience in this could be also helpful. Next one, please. Then in most of the cases, the banks do have policies that set regulations on how information should be disclosed about their projects and activities. So what I put on the presentation are also screenshots on the World Bank and on the Inter-American Development Bank on how to try to find projects. Again, you can also find them searching specific sectors, specific areas, and that's information that is public, even if you don't need to actively request for that. So the first stage for you to find information, of course, you have the information or the sources for information that I mentioned before that could help you find information even if the project has not been approved, and trying to get more tools on how to access information about companies and banks. Then you can try to get information out of the official websites. Sometimes they take extra time to upload documents, and sometimes they don't upload all the documents needed for you to properly assess a project, but at least you need to check what they have available in their websites, and those are screenshots of that type of information. Next one, please. So that would be the results. Yeah, that one. That would be results if you go to the, if you search specific projects, and then if you click on one project, you have the information that you can see now on the screen. So what are the type of, I mean, they have usually documents connected to that specific project, the money that has been funded, and usually many documents that show how the interaction between the government and the bank or company has been moving forward. If you can't find information, or if the information that you find, the next one please, the information that you find in their, so the previous one, but it's the information that it's publicly available on the website for specific projects, you can also request for information. And on your screen you can see that both the World Bank and the IDB, and that's the case for other development banks, usually have links that lead to forms for you to raise questions and specific on specific type of information that you need. Next one, please. So in that slide, you can see examples of these forms. These forms are connected to specific access to information policies that state what type of information the bank is supposed to disclose to the public when requested to do so, and what are the exceptions under which they can refuse to give information. There are also rules on what are the dates and within which they need to answer, but that's probably too much information, but just it's important to know that that's available for people to request information that they couldn't find otherwhere in other parts, either of their website or in meetings with governments or with banks in their countries. And next one, please. And just as a piece of advice as well, it's important to know that some of this information, the next one, please, could be connected to, and that's probably, yeah, it could be connected to also Freedom of Information Acts within your country. So in some cases, for instance, we have had bad experiences with the Inter-American Development Bank responding to requests in Argentina, and when that happens, we also try to use the domestic tools. So we use our national law for access to information and try to look for that information that it's, even if that's bank-related information, depending on how public information is defined in your law, you could also try to use domestic tools for that. And I think that with that, I will be finishing my part of the presentation. I'll be happy to answer questions or comments.
Thanks so much, Juan. Does anyone have any direct questions or comments for Juan right now? If not, we'll move on to the next speaker. And actually questions, Jessica could also entertain questions right now. All right. Well, in that case, we will move on to our next presenter. Chris Genovese is going to talk with us about policies and complaint mechanisms at the banks, and Chris is with SOMO, the Center for Research on Multinational Corporations. Go ahead, Chris.
Great, thanks. Thanks everybody for participating. Yeah, as well as Juan mentioned, and as the name suggests, SOMO does research on corporations and documents their impact on communities, workers, and the environment. And the work that I do is to help communities file complaints to various grievance mechanisms. So if you can have the next slide, please. So we've already gone over this a little bit, but I like to put up this slide to give a sense of the architecture of a development bank, so you know who decisions, so that later you can hold them accountable or try to influence the decisions that they're making. This is the structure of the World Bank Group, but most other development banks have a similar structure. So as you can see, the top level there is the Board of Governors. That's made up of the members of the World Bank Group. It's usually the Minister of Finance or Treasury who's on the Board of Governors. They meet once or twice a year, and they basically look at the big picture issues, the strategy, the direction of the bank, how much capital the bank has, that sort of thing. But the day-to-day decisions are made by the Board of Directors. The Board of Directors are government representatives. They either represent one or multiple governments on the board of the bank. They take decisions about the loans that are made, and they also approve the policies that the bank applies to those loans. And then you have the president of the bank. He's the head of the management. In the case of the World Bank, you have two agencies that fund government entities. That's IDA and IBRD, and then two agencies that deal with the private sector for the most part. That's the IFC and MIGA. So you can see that the next level down is they're the clients of the bank, so either governments or companies. And then below that, of course, are the people who are affected by those projects that are financed by the bank, the community members. And for those community members who feel that they have been adversely affected by the public side of the World Bank, they can file a complaint to the inspection panel. That's the tan box on the upper left there. And for those affected by a project financed by the private sector side of the World Bank Group, they can file a complaint to the Compliance Advisor Ombudsman, or CAO. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, and as Juan mentioned earlier, the board of directors of all of these banks have approved environmental and social policies that must be applied to their lending. These generally get revised from time to time, and now we're sort of seeing a little bit of harmonization across the development banks. So usually what you'll see is that the bank has an environmental and social sustainability policy that outlines what the bank itself has to do, and usually that involves doing the assessment of the project, looking to see whether the client or the borrower has the capacity to implement environmental and social standards. The bank will also usually have a policy on access to information, as Juan said, and that details what kind of information and will be published and when that information will be published. And then the bank also has to monitor and supervise to make sure that the client itself is implementing the more detailed environmental and social standards. So then there's usually a detailed set of standards for the client itself, and I've listed here the types of requirements or the categories of standards that they usually have. There's usually always an environmental and social impact assessment standard, so that will require how that assessment should be done. It usually requires that the affected community is consulted and the information is disclosed to them. There's usually labor standards which look at freedom of association and occupational health and safety and discrimination issues. Resource efficiency and pollution prevention, which looks at emission standards. Also community health, safety, and security. That one looks at sort of emergency planning, issues around security personnel, and that sort of thing. There's a land acquisition and involuntary resettlement for projects that entail the displacement of communities, whether it's a dam or something else. That requires consultation and compensation for different impacts of resettlement. Biodiversity conservation that sets out certain standards about what types of habitats can be impacted. or not. There's Indigenous Peoples Standard, and increasingly banks are incorporating the right to free, prior, and informed consent in their Indigenous Peoples policies, as well as other standards. Cultural heritage, looking at significant sacred sites and requiring consent for any impacts on those. And then some banks will have a specific set of standards around stakeholder engagements, so how you identify and engage with affected communities. Other banks will have specific set of standards around when banks provide loans to other financial institutions. So a development bank can also provide a loan to a national or regional commercial bank. And then there's a different set of standards that applies to what that bank can do with the money. So it's important to know what these standards are. They can get kind of technical. They're not very interesting to read. But these are what the banks need to be held accountable to. So if you have questions about whether these standards are being implemented correctly, you can go to the project leaders from the bank themselves, the people at the bank that are in charge of that specific project, or you can go to the board of that bank if you want to raise concerns about whether or not these standards are being implemented in your particular project. You can of course go to the media and say that the bank is not respecting their own commitments, that sort of thing. So it's these are good. It's good to have a grip on what's actually required in a particular project. Next slide, please. Okay, and so as I mentioned, each bank will have its own what we call an independent accountability mechanism. So this is a mechanism that is designed to receive complaints from communities that feel that they've been adversely affected by a project that's financed by the bank. We call them independent because there are certain protections in place to ensure that they are independent from the actual operations of the bank. So in the case of the World Bank, for example, on the public side, the inspection panel reports directly to the board of the World Bank. So they don't report to the people who made the decisions about the implementation of the project has affected you. And the inspection panel is made up of 3 people who are hired from outside of the bank. They're usually people who are eminent in their fields, who have expertise in a particular subject matter, and they can't go and work for the bank after their term on the panel has concluded. So there's a bunch of these different measures to make sure that these mechanisms are really independent from the bank itself, and they were actually created because of pressure from civil society. So they are actually sort of a product of the work that we all do. And in that way, I think it's also our responsibility to keep them honest and make sure that they are doing their job well. And they have a network, so they meet, all the mechanisms meet once a year. This is a photo of a meeting that they had a few years ago in Washington, D.C. Civil society has had some engagement in their annual meetings. That website down there is a website that the mechanisms themselves created, so it lists all the different mechanisms associated with development banks if you want to know more about any particular one. Next slide. So what are these grievance mechanisms? They usually have one or more of the following functions. They can do compliance reviews. So they can review the project to investigate whether or not the bank has assured itself that the environmental and social policies have been implemented in that project. So they'll do usually a fact-finding mission on the ground. They'll talk to everybody involved. They'll review documents, and they'll produce a report that will have findings of non-compliance or compliance. And then usually the bank has to respond to that investigation with an action plan saying what they're going to do to address those findings of non-compliance. The mechanisms can also have like a problem-solving function, so they can try and bring the communities, the complainants, together with their own clients for a mediation or negotiation to try and resolve the conflict. That usually or hopefully would end up in an agreement that the mechanism would then monitor to ensure that the commitments that were made are being implemented. And then a few mechanisms also have an advisory function where they can look and draw lessons learned from the cases to make some findings about whether or not the policies are really being implemented, if there's a particular trend or a troubling challenge for the bank. And as I said, some of these combine these functions, and I really feel that these are our mechanisms. So if we don't like them, then we should change them or tell them to do better. I just did that today. Next slide, please. So what they're not. These mechanisms certainly have their own limitations. They are definitely not a substitute for judicial mechanisms. If you have access to a good judiciary and you're able to have the resources to access it, then I would certainly think that would be a more effective way to resolve the concerns. They're only half the response, so as I said, the mechanism can produce a report, but then the bank itself will develop and come up with its own response to determine how it will respond to the problem. And often that's where we see the problems. They don't really respond in a way that's adequate. The mechanisms don't have the authority to stop a project. A few of the mechanisms can recommend that the project be suspended if there are concerns about immediate harm. They're only as good as the standards they enforce. So if the bank itself doesn't have good standards, then the mechanisms can't hold them to anything else. They have to hold them to the standards that they've committed to. They can't, for example, hold them to human rights standards if the bank itself hasn't adopted those standards. And we always recommend that it should be part of a larger campaign. So you can't only rely on filing a complaint. You have to do advocacy. You have to work with the media. You have to do the local organizing that we all do in our work. Next slide, please. So what do you need to know? These mechanisms have some rules about who can file, when they can file, about what they can file. And so each mechanism will have its own website that will have information on their rules of procedure that you should look at. That will also give you an idea of important deadlines throughout the process, throughout the complaint process. And it will have some sample complaints or a format that you can fill out if you think that would be useful in developing your complaint. And so one aspect I wanted to highlight here is that all mechanisms will allow you to request confidentiality if you're concerned that having your complaint public will put you in danger. That you are not allowed to submit an anonymous complaint, but the mechanism itself will protect your identity and not disclose it to both inside or outside of the bank. As Jessica mentioned, some of the mechanisms are now developing further measures to try and protect complainants. But I would definitely say that if you're concerned about your safety in filing a complaint, I would talk to the mechanism first, even before filing a complaint, and ask them what they would be able to do to try and help protect you or prevent any reprisals. And certainly when you file a complaint, you should raise the issue with the mechanism and tell them what you think they should do to help protect you. So have that conversation early with them. Next slide, please. So just wanted to go over just a general sort of how you go, what you should think about when you're thinking about filing a complaint. So who are the complainants? So you need to identify who are going to be the set of complainants behind this complaint. Then normally you would have a point of contact for the mechanism, somebody who's in charge of communicating that with the mechanism and then sharing the rest of the complainants. So things to think about, sort of how the complainants, how you and the complainants will make decisions throughout the process, who's going to speak on your behalf. What other kind of capacity do you need? Do you need to find somebody who has legal expertise or some technical expertise? How are you going to communicate more broadly about this complaint, either to the media or otherwise? And then who your allies are. Do you work with other NGOs nationally or internationally who can help support you? Next slide, please. And then what do you want to achieve by this complaint? Are you just trying to raise awareness? Filing a complaint can really help raise the profile of an issue because you're getting media attention and you're trying to elevate the issue to higher decision-making levels within the bank. Are you looking for a remedy for the harm? Are you looking for something to change on the ground? Are you just looking for attenuation of the facts? Do you want to stop the project? All of those, deciding what you want then helps you figure out how to approach the mechanism. And whether you want to request that the mechanism do a problem solving or mediation, or whether you want the mechanism to do an investigation to see if the policies have been implemented, or both. Normally I say if you're interested in stopping a project, then I think mediation is not the best course because there's not much to talk about when with the client when you want to stop the project and they want to continue it. Next slide, please. So then after you file the complaint, there's still a lot of work to do. So when you file, you really need to be prepared to see it through to the end, and sometimes it can take a while. Usually, or in the best scenario, it will take a year to a year and a half. But I've been working on cases that have gone much longer than that, 4 or 5 years, 6, 7 years in the case of a mediation. So that's why it's really important to, at the beginning, really make sure that you have the resources and capacity to see it through for some time. So the mechanism might come back and ask you some questions. They might come for a site visit. You could potentially comment on drafts of the compliance report. You'll need to lobby the board of the bank and, of course, use the media. So making sure you're thinking about these things at the beginning. Next slide. Yep. So thanks. Sorry, hope I didn't take too long, and I look forward to your questions later.
All right, thank you, Chris. I see that we have 2 questions. First question comes from Marianne Comfort, and she says, these look like very stringent obligations of the banks and the clients. Why are we seeing such problems? Is it that these obligations aren't enforced?
Yes. So I think part of or a lot of the problem is that the banks rely on the information provided by them to determine whether or not the policies are being implemented. And they don't do a lot of independent verification of that information. So the bank will come down, they'll maybe stay in the capital city, they'll meet with their client in a nice pretty office space, and very rarely will they actually go out to a community and ask people whether or not the standards are being met. So that's definitely sort of related to that is the fact that the clients are not required to disclose to the communities that they have access to these grievance mechanisms. So in most cases, the communities don't even know that the bank is involved, that these policies should apply, or that they could file a complaint. So the feedback loop is broken. A lot of the standards do include a lot of discretion. So they they can interpret the standards in a very strict way or in a very flexible way, and oftentimes it's a very flexible way. So yeah, I think we're seeing a lot of problems with the way that the policies are being implemented, and then the way that the banks are failing to supervise that.
Great, thanks. And if you have a follow-up question, feel free to chat it in. And Amy Van Zanen, or Zanen, sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name, with Gender Action, says, so you talked about the standards that apply to an international financial institution's own projects, but do those standards then apply to projects that that bank is invested in, but are implemented by other institutions? So if for instance, the World Bank invests in a project by the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, is the World Bank still obligated to make sure that the World Bank standards are being met?
Well, the short answer is yes. So if two development banks are co-financing a project, then the banks are still should still be held accountable to their own standards. Practically speaking, though, what happens is the banks will develop some kind of memorandum of understanding which identifies which bank is going to take the lead to do the assessment of environmental and social impacts and their due diligence process. So the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, might say, okay, we're just going to let the World Bank sort of review the environmental and social impact assessment to see if it's done well and to see what measures need to be put in place to mitigate the impacts, and we'll just rely on their expertise for that. That's usually the case, but that doesn't excuse them from complying with their own policies. So you can still file a complaint to that bank's mechanism. This isn't a good example because the AIIB doesn't have their mechanism in place yet, but you can, and we often do, when we file a complaint, we'll file it at multiple grievance mechanisms at the same time.
Okay, thanks so much for that. Again, keep those questions coming in the chat function if you have them. And we're going to go ahead to the next presentation. We're going to hear from Anne van Ooyek with Both Ends in the Netherlands, and also Mark Foder with CE Bank Watch in Central and Eastern Europe. We're going to start with Anna, and they're both going to be discussing advocacy strategies and campaigns. Do you want to go ahead, Anna?
Yes, hi everyone, thank you. So I want to talk a bit about advocacy strategies and then give you one of the an example of a campaign that I've been working on, and then I will hand over to Mark. So after having identified which banks are involved in the case you're trying to address, and also after knowing how to get access to the information of these banks, it is important to think about how you're actually going to approach the banks and how you're going to make them do what you want them to do. First slide, please. So before starting your advocacy strategy, it is always important to first assess what it is that you really want from the bank. So what is it that you want to achieve? What is your aim? And also what is within the leverage of the bank? So what can the bank actually do about it? It is also important to think about the cost benefit, so what will probably work best and what will yield the best results. This, of course, will be different in any situation, in any project, and it will also depend largely on the bank, what bank it is, what structure it has, etc. Additionally, I just wanted to stress that it's very much possible and also very much advisable to combine different advocacy strategies and to not put all your efforts into just one. And lastly, before you start, I would advise you to look for allies, so link to organizations, national or international organizations that are also working on the banks that you're trying to influence. And yeah, of course, use each other's contacts and each other's entry points so you can strengthen each other's work. Next slide, please. So I've set out a few advocacy strategies for you that I think are useful when approaching development banks. Firstly, you can, of course, talk to the banks and try to convince them of your points through dialogue. Of course, you would need to know who to contact in the banks, and this would depend on the position of the person in the bank and also on the level of influence this person has. Mostly the most logical contact points in development banks would be the people in the sustainability departments, people in charge of your project, or even maybe public affairs officers, communication officers, or if you want to take it higher up, the management of the board of the banks. It is important to invest in building up relationships and to get to know people you're trying to convince and to look for allies. So it would be good to know what they find important and whether or not they are on your side. Secondly, you can use political pressure because development banks are partially or fully state-owned and use public money to invest. It is also very helpful to call upon the responsibility of the involved governments. So in this case, you could think about writing letters to responsible ministers, sharing information with civil servants, or also involving embassies in the countries that you work in. You can also use public campaigning. So you could use the general public, of course, to increase the pressure on the banks to change or to get them to do something that you want them to do. This can, for example, consist of a public petition. You could organize public events and debates, but you could also, of course, organize mobilizations or protests at the project site and or at the bank's offices. You can involve the media. So you can use the media to increase awareness of the issue and also to increase the public pressure on the banks. This can really vary from detailed newspaper articles about the case, but can also consist of quicker social media campaigns. Then I wanted to address file and complain. Chris just said a lot about it, so I won't go into it now, but yeah, as you just heard, most development banks have independent grievance mechanisms that could also help you reach your goal, depending on what that is. Then lastly, you can choose to press legal charges against the bank. This is mainly if the case and the capacity allow for it, and as Chris just mentioned, if you have good legal systems in the case that you're addressing. So this will likely cost a lot of time and money, but however, if it is successful, the outcomes can be very strong. Next slide, please. So I just want to give you an example as an illustration to the different advocacy strategies, an example of a case that I've been working on for the last year, and that is the Agua Zarca project in Honduras. Most of you would probably have heard about the Agua Zarca case, or Agua Zarca project, for the sad reason of the murder of the leader of the organization opposing the project, Berta Cáceres. So this project is being financed by 3 different development banks: the Finnish Development Bank, the Dutch Development Bank, and the Central American Development Bank. And as one of the strategies to stop the project, national and international groups decided to focus on the development banks financing the project to make the project stop. So we formed an international coalition of organizations from the Netherlands, Finland, Germany, because of the involvement of Siemens, and of course Honduras. And we tried to put pressure on the banks from all different sides. Next slide, please. So the main advocacy strategies we use, or are actually still using, is firstly dialogue. So we talk to the banks a lot, convincing them to withdraw their money from this project. And this also includes continuous efforts to convince the bank to speak to the affected people directly and to listen to what they have to say. So we write letters expressing our concerns, we request and share information, we join in consultation, etc. We also at the same time try to put political pressure, so we involve the Dutch and the Finnish governments, and we called on them to use their responsibility over the banks and to have them withdraw from the project. We also included pressure on the Dutch, Finnish and the EU embassies in Honduras, and to just make sure that they are informed and to act where they can. Part of this campaign was also a public campaign and using the media. So together as a coalition, we have organized a petition, published newspaper ads, organized protests both in the Netherlands as well as in Finland and in Honduras. We organized public events as well. And well, as you might know, the Aguasarca case actually got a lot of public attention. So as an outcome, the banks did announce that they would withdraw from the project permanently. And this was, can be seen, of course, as a success of this international coalition and more importantly for the local groups fighting the project. But however, the process is taking fairly long and the banks are still working on the way in which to withdraw. So I just want to reflect briefly, next slide please, on why I think that this advocacy strategy was at least relatively successful. Of course, this was quite a different case because it has such international exposure and got so much international attention, mainly because of the status of Berta Cáceres and the way in which she was known all over the world. And well, I think that the banks were relatively sensitive for this big international pressure and the negative attention that they got. But also I think it was very important that we formed such a strong international coalition, and we had a lot of reach, and also we focused on all different actors involved. So that's actually a separate point. I put it here as a separate point. So using the different advocacy strategies that I just set out and combining as many of them as you can. And because we were working in such a big coalition, we could actually combine many of them, and also the inside-outside strategy we could use. So we really choose for certain organizations to follow more of an inside strategy, which includes more the dialogue, talking to the banks and the politicians and the civil servants, and other organizations to focus more on the outside strategy, so the public campaign, the media, protests, that kind of, so that allowed us to do all at the same time. And also, of course, very important, there was a lot of focus on the voice of the affected people being heard directly by the banks, but also by the policymakers and in public campaigns. So actually people from Honduras visited Europe, Finland, Germany, and the Netherlands a couple of times, so they could be very involved in the actually advocacy process. So that was it for my example. I will hand over to Mark. He will give you another campaign example and tell you a bit about lessons learned after that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Mark. I'm with the Central and Eastern European Bank Watch Network, and our focus is primarily on two European institutions, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and the European Investment Bank. Now, what I want to talk about really is action in cases of emergency, something that, and using the banks in that. Basically, well, I'm going to go through two smaller examples here that we've seen, one a bit more recent, one a bit further, bit longer ago. The one that was a bit longer ago was in Ukraine. A few years ago, we had a situation where a transmission line was going to go through a village called Usatovo, and the community started protesting against it. Police went in, started to beat up the community. It got very brutal. When we found out about this, basically it was a transmission line that was being financed by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and we immediately informed them. We immediately informed them about the situation. They immediately took action to put pressure on the company to get the transmission line outside the village, as it was originally planned, and to stop attacking the locals. Another case, more recent, which wasn't maybe another more recent case we had in Jordan. I think it was last year or the year before, a power plant there where basically part of the community was excluded from consultations, and they started protesting, feeling that they too would be impacted by this power plant. The leader of the community was arrested, given 24 hours in jail. As he came out, he put it out on Facebook. The EBRD again was financing this one. Again, we saw the EBRD act. took a bit of time because there was some more harassment of the group protesting by the authorities, but the EBRD came out with a very strong message to the company and the authorities that this is unacceptable, and they basically told them to stop and helped remedy the situation to a certain degree. So I'm giving these two examples as cases where we saw, these are not grievance mechanisms that I'm talking about here. Going through the grievance mechanism, as Chris mentioned earlier, can take quite some time. I'm talking here about situations where you've got an emergency. Now, I should say these are relatively positive examples. It's not always as positive. We had a case actually just in December where we saw a person being framed. Drugs were put on him when he left the country and went to Latvia, got arrested at the airport. Luckily, the authorities in Latvia realized that it was a framing. This wasn't the first time someone from the community that was protesting against an EBRD and EIB joint project. It wasn't the first time that someone had been framed with drugs there. But given the fact that here we didn't have what you'd say sort of undisputable proof that it was the company or that it was the authorities that were framing this person, although many things seem to be pointing in that direction and it seems pretty obvious to an outsider. Because we didn't have this direct link out there, the banks were acting on it, and they seem to be acting on this innocent until proven guilty approach. We saw that again with beatings with harassment in Armenia, where we had some communities, actually activists, being defamed in the media and defamation in a country where that could lead to reprisals from the community. So what I really want to say about this is that, you know, if you have a situation where it's obvious it's the authorities or obvious it's the company, I mean, very clear direct link there, and you turn to at least the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development and European Investment Bank, we have seen them act. They can act. But, and this, well, actually, before I get into the but, one way is to contact the institution directly, if you know who to contact there. Another thing is, embassies were mentioned just before by Anna. I think it was Anna and Chris might have mentioned them too. Embassies are another way to act. These banks all have what I would call progressive countries on their board of directors. And you can turn to embassies in your country that would be relevant and that would be able to basically put pressure on the bank to also get the bank to act. So you either contact the bank directly, you contact embassies of countries that are shareholders on that bank, and the third group to contact for help in this case are organizations like Bankwatch that will know these banks, that will know which embassies are worth contacting, and will be able to get you directly to the person or the persons who can act in a case like this. But as I said, and this is getting back to limitations, one of them is that they'll only act if it's very direct proof. Another one, and this is a risk that Jessica mentioned at the very beginning, the risk of reprisals. And it gets a bit to what Jessica and Chris were saying too. It's not just about reprisals. There's a security risk in that these institutions, we are pushing, and it looks like they are making steps, but they're a bit slow to do it, to improve their security in communications with them. But we have seen in the past situations where complainants, I mean, the companies found out there were reprisals against the people. And this is something that still has to be, still has to be fixed with these institutions, and I mean, we're working on it, but basically, it's something to keep in mind when dealing with this. So, I know we're limited in time, so I think I've covered the time I have, but there was one case that Gretchen was asking me to potentially talk about if there is going to be time for that. That's slightly different, but this is basically the summary of what I wanted to talk about. It's yeah, that's about it. We can use them in emergency situations.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Anna. Why don't I invite Mark to share that other example, and Jess to share, or Chris to share other examples that they have. I think it's good to sort of illustrate for folks what ways can the banks act, and what have the banks done in the past that was positive, or what asks can you put before them. So maybe Mark, you can start, and then some others can jump in.
I see a question actually about what type of security risks leaks by staff. Well, we did see some kind of leaking in one situation with the European Investment Bank a few years ago. Cybersecurity, yes, I mean the sites are not secure. They don't have secure communications. So cybersecurity is a risk, especially if you're in a country where hacking is known to happen. So there too, that is something that, I mean, that you have to keep in mind too. They don't have secure communication channels right now. We're pushing for them to have it, and they seem to be open to that conversation, but we're not there yet. So I think, I don't know if that answers your question, Amy. Should I go on to the example then, Gretchen?
Yeah.
I mean, the Azerbaijan was a bit of an example of, I wouldn't know if it's the banks acting or the governments acting as a result of the pressure we were putting on the banks. Was probably more, well, it's a combination. So Azerbaijan, there are actually a number of huge projects that are about bringing gas from Azerbaijan to Europe, to the EU in particular. And includes pipeline, it includes investment in gas extraction. We basically raised concerns about working with a country with huge human rights problems, where a lot of human rights offenders actually are just being activists are thrown in prison. We were raising it at the general meetings of both the EBRD and the Asian Development Bank also, which actually had its meeting the year that this was being approved at the in Azerbaijan. We were, I mean, we've been targeting also since the other banks involved, which include the European Investment Bank, the World Bank, just throwing out a bunch of bank names. But basically, there were a number of regional banks and sort of development banks involved. As a result of that, the banks did not back down. At least we didn't see them back down from any of the projects. But what we did see is we were complaining not just to the banks but to the governments about the situation in Azerbaijan and about about banks investing in Azerbaijan with this situation in the country. And I'd like to say it's as a result of our work, although I think it's there were other factors as well. But what we did see in Azerbaijan is while the investments did not stop, we did see on the one hand that there was increasing pressure on Azerbaijan to improve its human rights situation. There were a number of activists released. We do see, especially from the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, but I think the European Investment Bank and other banks are also pushing Azerbaijan on one thing, on a it's called the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. Basically, a package that's there about how countries should behave in terms of their work with extractive industries. In this case, obviously, gas extraction, which includes a number of human rights-related public participation type measures. So this is again, it's not that sort of emergency situation I was talking about a few minutes ago, but it is a situation where we did have a focus on human rights that did seem to contribute to change if it didn't result directly in change in the country.
Thanks, Mark. And so Azerbaijan was either demoted or kicked out or somehow then downgraded within the EITI ranking. Do we want to hear an example, Anna or Jess or Chris?
I can come in now. This is Jess. Just to build on the Azerbaijan example a little bit more, because I think that this is a great example of what colleagues have been talking about the need for a multi-pronged approach, and the IFI focus just being one element of that. The reason that the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative the reason that it showed real leverage with the government of Azerbaijan is because the government of Azerbaijan was nervous that if they remained in their downgraded status with EITI, that they wouldn't receive the extractive industries financing from the international financial institutions. Now, it turned out that even though they were downgraded, the international financial institutions went ahead and funded these projects anyway, as Mark said, which, to be honest, is a great disappointment for the IFIs, because they continually emphasize their commitment to the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, and they keep talking about the importance of community participation, yet they go ahead and fund these highly risky projects within this incredibly concerning context. But I think it's an example of while we had strong statements coming from some governments with respect to Azerbaijan, they were quite limited, and it was EITI that was the first one to be very clear that the situation for civil society in Azerbaijan was so bad that it was going to be the first country ever downgraded because of its lack of compliance with the EITI civil society protocol. So just to reinforce what others have said about having these multi-pronged approaches and thinking about the IFIs within the context of that. A couple of examples that I've come across, and unfortunately the World Bank does not have the same record as Mark has described with respect to the EBRD, but it did. Now 15 or so years ago, there are some quite good examples of where the World Bank spoke out both to support public protests as well as to support an individual who brought a complaint to the inspection panel. Now, I'm mentioning these even though they're so old because I think that they're nice broad examples and those that we can call on the institutions to follow. The first is in Cambodia back in 2002. There were a series of public protests, and a representative of the World Bank was interviewed by the media about concerns of the protests, and the representative emphasized the importance of public protests and people being able to freely share their views in order to get development projects right. And I think that's the kind of message that we want to see reinforced very clearly from all of the IFIs, that actually they don't need to use human rights messaging, but they need to emphasize the importance of people speaking freely in order to get development right. And I think that gives us, it changes the influence that they can have over governments if they don't use the human rights messaging, but instead talk about the importance of freedom of speech for development effectiveness. The other example is the complainant, one of the representatives of complainants. So not a community member, but actually a political activist in Chad, was the representative for the community in a complaint brought to the inspection panel about the Chad-Cameroon pipeline, which is a continually problematic project financed by the World Bank and the International Finance Corporation. Now, he was also someone who ran for president, and he and 5 of his political colleagues were arrested and horribly tortured back in the early 2000s. Actually, this was the second time that he was arrested. And the World Bank, it was challenging for civil society to get the message to the right people in the World Bank because the bank structure is such that any bad news is kept from the president as much as possible. But one of our colleagues within civil society managed to get a message directly to the president of the bank at the time, President Wolfenson, And immediately President Wolfenson picked up the phone, called the President of Chad, and all 6 of these activists, not only the one who was the representative of the inspection panel, were released within 2 hours. And the bank was able to get him to France, where he was able to get treatment for the torture that he had suffered. So that's quite an unusual example, but one that we should keep in mind, I think, because it's so strong and it's what we really want to see the IFIs live up to. More recently, in 2 countries that we've been working which are challenging, Uzbekistan and Ethiopia, we've seen the bank, at least behind closed doors, raise some concerns about attacks against independent activists who are monitoring and raising concerns about development projects. In Uzbekistan, it's had somewhat of an impact because the World Bank has been raising these concerns somewhat consistently. It's still not enough in my view, but at least it's clear to the government of Uzbekistan that the World Bank cares about attacks against human rights defenders within the country. In Ethiopia, we haven't even been that lucky, I have to say. It's an environment in which there's been an ongoing attack against independent civil society for more than 5 years now. So much so that there really isn't independent, organised civil society that's doing advocacy work within the country. And the bank refuses to acknowledge that. The inspection panel has emphasised that the World Bank hasn't recognised these limitations within its own environmental and social analysis, yet the World Bank hasn't changed the way it's behaved. And in that country, an activist who worked for the inspection panel as their translator during an investigation was subsequently arrested, charged with terrorism, together with 6 others. Now all 6 of the others have been released, and he's the only one that continues to face charges. So it's and the World Bank in this case said, we've asked the Ethiopian government about this, and the government tells us that the justice system is independent, which we all know is a ridiculous suggestion, and that the World Bank must let justice take its course. And the bank hasn't then responded publicly or in any way used its leverage to support this individual, despite how clear it is that he's facing trumped-up charges. So the record is very mixed, and we have a long way to go with the institutions. But despite that, the World Bank is putting some degree of very light pressure on the government in these cases.
Thanks, Jess. So just in the last 1 minute, Anna or Chris want to jump in for 1 minute?
Well, I'd be happy to share some cases, but if anybody has any questions, maybe we should.
I'm just not seeing there. Yes, there aren't any more in the chat. So.
Okay. Well,
I mean, 1 minute.
Yeah, there are cases which sort of show the potential, and the problem is we're just not seeing those results consistently across cases. No. We just had a case at the International Finance Corporation where they divested from a gold mine in Colombia, in the Páramo, in a very sensitive ecosystem, where the complainants were also receiving threats for protesting the project. That's a very rare outcome, but it is possible given the right factors, and it's something that we're working to ensure that it happens more consistently when the situation deserves it.
Okay, thanks so much. Well, with time, we're going to have to stop now. So thanks everyone for joining. We will send out the slides and notes from the presentation. And I do invite you to find out more at www.rightsindevelopment.org or send us an email. We do have a listserv for groups working on these campaigns around human rights defenders and financial institutions. So do let us know if you'd like to get involved in that work or to learn more. So thanks everyone, and we're going to end it here.